We've been looking at a book by Bruce Riley Ashford. The book is called Every Square Inch, and it's on the intersection of culture and theology. In this episode, I'd like to look at the first three chapters: competing views on theology and culture, a theology of culture, and then culture and calling. Now, Ashford starts by defining culture. Let me just quote him. Culture is anything that humans produce when they interact with each other and with God's creation. When we interact with each other and with God's creation, we cultivate the ground, grain, vegetables, and livestock. We produce artifacts like clothing, housing, cars. We build institutions, governments, businesses, schools. We form worldviews, theism or pantheism or even atheism. We participate in religions like Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, even atheism. We produce culture, and at the same time, our cultural context shapes us, affecting who we are, what we think, what we do, and how we feel. Now, I was able to go and live overseas for 17 years. 12 of those were spent in Colombia, 5 of those in Canada. I was pretty oblivious to what culture was until I experienced living outside my own culture. As a missionary in Latin America, we were to learn the culture, and very quickly I discovered that simple little things were the things that tripped me up the most. Things like, where do you put your hands when you're eating? Now, I grew up in rural mid-America, and I learned that you would pick up your fork in your left hand, cut your meat with your right hand, put the knife down, transfer the fork to your right hand, eat, put the fork down, put your hands in your lap, and chew. Very complicated process, but all of us do it. All of us in rural mid-America eat in about the same way. We're taught as children, don't just grab the meat and throw it in your mouth and chew it. That's not polite. That's not cultured. Do it kind of like I just described. Well, I got to Colombia and found out that you hold the fork in your left hand and the knife in your right hand, and you never put them down. You hold them the entire meal. You never put your hands in your lap. I did that once, and the person I was eating with said, "What are you doing with your hands?" I learned very quickly that even minor things like that portray culture. Now, Ashford goes on. He turns to looking at competing views of theology and culture. Now, he's certainly not the first to do this. Richard Niebuhr, in his book, Christ and Culture, laid out much of Ashford's approach, but Ashford has some input that helps us understand the options. Ashford says the first option that we have is to see as Christ as pitted against culture. Christ against culture. Culture is seen by the church as a menace. Culture is constantly changing, and the church relies on a document written 2,000 years ago. The church is somewhat change averse. The church doesn't like change. So when culture changes around us, it becomes hard for the church to distinguish culture from its Christianity. As a result, many times the church believes that the shifting culture is an attempt to change Christianity. as a missionary living in Latin America, I was taught that a fish, for example, doesn't have a concept of what water is until the fish is extracted from water. When the fish is extracted from water, it has a very deep sense of water and a longing for water. So, human beings, when we're extracted from our culture, we tend to identify that culture much more easily than when we simply live in it. And when culture begins to shift around us, our initial tendency is to reject the change and to want things to stay the same, to say that staying the same is actually Christianity. It's actually biblical. Ashford talks about two segments of the church that see Christ against culture, that sees culture as a menace. Part of that segment he calls, or one segment, he calls the church as a bomb shelter. Christians gathered together to protect themselves against the invading menace of culture. They'll come together and talk about the good old days and how horrible things are becoming. The second segment of the church, he calls the church as the ultimate fighting church. We gather together in this segment of the church to learn how to wage war against culture. Now, some of this approach is accurate. We're going to see that in a little bit. But both approaches don't see the call of Christ for the church to engage the world, to be in the world, but not of it. That comes from John 17, 14 to 16. A second way that culture and church are competing views is by saying that Christ is actually of culture. Culture is seen as a natural and even a godly progression toward God's kingdom. The church must adapt itself to the ever-changing culture and reflect what's seen there. In minor things like dress and music, but in major things as well. The culture's understanding, for example, of an LGBT lifestyle and the acceptability of that lifestyle. Some churches have embraced that change and said that is the way the church needs to go. This approach doesn't recognize that culture can be corrupted and distorted by sin. The church is called to be a prophetic voice against the sin that pervades our culture. Ashford then presents what he believes is an appropriate interaction of Christ and culture. He says that is Christ in and for culture. Let me quote him. A third and better mindset is one that views human beings as representatives of Christ, who lives their lives in the midst of and for the good of their cultural context, and whose cultural lives are characterized by obedience to God's word and witness to his kingdom. Now, in this point, Ashford actually goes back to the creation narrative, and he distinguishes there between structure and direction. The structure is the world that God has created. At the end of every day of creation, God looked at the world he had created, the structure that was there, and said, it is good. The direction is the commandments that he gave man to rule over his creation, to be fruitful and multiply and spread what God had begun in the Garden of Eden through the rest of the world. Structure and direction in the original creation are good. Then Genesis 3 comes. Man sins. And with sin, the structure remains good, but the direction of mankind became corrupted and misdirected by sin. Instead of reigning over mankind, the creation, mankind now rules. He now oppresses the creation. He does it for his own benefit, not for the benefit of creation. At this point, Ashford says, for this reason, our mission as Christian includes identifying the ways in which our cultures are corrupted and misdirected by sin, and then doing everything in our power to help bring healing and redirection to them. When we do this, we are obeying Christ and being a witness. Now, that opens the door to chapter 2, the theology of culture. In this point, Ashford starts again with the fall because he believes the fall is a pivotal point in any theological understanding of culture. The implications I'm quoting here, the implications of the fall for a discussion of human culture are massive. Sin defiles everything spiritually. Humans are idolaters worshiping God's gifts instead of worshiping God himself. He refers to Colossians 3:5. Rationally, humans have difficulty discerning the truth, and they use their capacities to construct vain philosophies. And he refers to Romans 1:18-21. Creatively, humans use their imagination to create and worship idols rather than to worship the living God. And he refers to Isaiah 40:18-20. Relationally, humans use their power to exploit others and serve themselves. And he refers to Genesis 5:8. He continues his quote, as a result, any and all human culture is distorted and defaced by sin. No dimension of culture is left unscathed by sin's pervasive reach. That ends the quote. Ashford goes on. He says that it's into this world of sin that God begins a movement toward redemption. He says that the doctrines of redemption and restoration merge with the doctrine of creation in affirming the goodness of God's creation. And he says, secondly, the doctrine of restoration merges with the doctrine of creation in its affirmation of the value of faithful culture work. He says we can and must transform culture. That is our call as Christians. In essence, and here again I quote, God restores his creation instead of trashing it. And he expects us to minister within our cultural context, rather than attempting to extract ourselves from it. Now, he uses a very simple metaphor here. He talks about a hungry child. He says, God is all powerful, certainly has the capability of providing that child with manna from heaven so he can eat. But rather than doing that, God uses us. He uses our vocations to feed that hungry child. Vocations from farmers who grow the food to co-ops that receive and distribute the food to factories, factory workers who package it, truckers who ship it, grocery stores who sell it, families who work at jobs to provide money to buy it, and in the end, the hungry child is fed. It's the vocation that God has given us, not necessarily a clerical vocation, but the simple vocation that God has given us, whether that is a teacher, whether that is a factory worker, whether that is a farmer, whatever it is. We are to exercise that vocation in a way that will help move the good structure that remains in God's creation back toward the original design of God's creation, which is to care for each other, to care for the creation God has given us. He goes on, he says that we're called in 4 spheres of influence to redeem the culture that we're in. Those 4 spheres of influence are family, church, workplace, and community. In our families, we learn to love each other and to love the people that God has placed us among. In our church, we learn to love God and love and care for each other. In our workplace, we learn to love not only in word, but also in deed, by the actions, by the actual jobs that we perform. In our communities, we learn to care and provide for others in ways that reflects true Christian conviction and love. Now, as Ashford moves through his book, he's going to look at each segment of the world that we live in, each segment of culture, in terms of the distortion and corruption of the fall, how sin has changed contemporary culture to be something that is not pleasing to God. And then he'll talk about ways in which we can engage that culture and move it back towards a restored image of what God wants from the world. What I found really encouraging about his book, Every Square Inch, is the way he tries to reclaim culture for Christ. He encourages us to live, love, and go like Jesus in the midst of our culture so that we can restore that culture. Now, culture is ever changing. As soon as we work and we find restoration in one area, another area seems to break down. That's just the way things happen. We have a never-ending call to engage our culture, to engage the culture that we are a part of, the culture that also helps to shape us. We have a never-ending call to revert that culture back to the culture that God originally created, the direction of the structure that God created, so that we can see it reflected more in our contemporary culture. In essence, caring for, loving, and providing for those who live around us. The next time we get together, we'll talk about 6 examples from history of people who have done just that. 2 from ancient history and 4 from fairly contemporary history.